And good afternoon, Trinidad and Tobago. Good afternoon, everyone. Good to have you back.
Good afternoon, Ozzi. Yes, good to be back.
Well, I understand you were not on vacation, you were working.
Yes.
All right, great. Well, we have an interesting program here this afternoon where I want to place a little emphasis a little bit on the alternatives.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll explain what that means in a little bit. But before I do that, I need to address two comments that came from certain persons, one being the Minister of Labour. The Minister of Labour indicated some time back that somehow the President General, Commandant Roger, was not correct in terms of what he said with regards to the retrenchments taking place in Trinidad and Tobago.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the fact of the matter is, I myself was in that meeting that was being referred to, and the facts are this, that the minister did admit that the numbers that they have at the ministry are not the real reflection of the number of people being retrenched, because under the Retrenchment and Severance Benefit Act, a company, even a state enterprise, do not have to report these numbers to the ministry if they are retrenching 5 and under persons. So in effect, what you're seeing there is a little loophole. Because if you calculate the number of persons overall across the various sectors, you would find that the number is far more than what the numbers would have at the ministry. Now, what is incorrect about that? That is, he is very correct when he says that the ministry do not have the overall figures because of that loophole. And the point being, Avron, is that people are being sent home, and we cannot ignore that. And this thing about people being sent home is a very serious thing, because when you are taken out of your job, Avron, especially in times like these, which means getting us another job would be even more difficult, then what in fact you're doing is you are impacting in a very real and severe way the lives of families. And we cannot ignore that, and we can't just hide behind numbers and statistics. The fact is, for every one person that is being retrenched, it is a family that is being affected, and therefore a community will be affected. And we cannot also ignore the social impact that will have in the medium and long term. So that's one point. The second point that required clarification is, why did the unions take a stand and withdraw or suspended their participation in the Tripartite Advisory Council? And it is simply this. You created a mechanism whereby that mechanism can be used to build national consensus on sharing the burden of adjustment in these times. In other words, we're saying, okay, here you have this mechanism, which mechanism, by the way, was advocated for and enshrined, here it is, in the Memorandum of Understanding, so that we foresaw that was going to come. And if the country was paying attention to the various Labor Day speeches in 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, the labor movement was warning the country that there isn't growth. The economy was not growing. So you could actually have more revenue, but it don't mean that your economy itself is growing. In fact, what has been happening is that we've been seeing a downward trend in the economy, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. But the point being, you create this mechanism. So you have the partners, you have labor, you have the employer class, and you have government. But what was taking place is that whilst we're sitting around the table, and the fact of the matter is that it took a while before that tripartite council get itself going. But whilst that is happening, you had retrenchments taking place. So whilst you're with me around the table and we're discussing, let us say, a peace accord, whilst you're doing that, you're shooting troops. You're shooting my troops outside. So then how can I stay in that space? And the straw that broke the camel's back was when the state itself, not just the private sector and the business community, but the state itself decided to go along the line of mass retrenchment. And of course, one of the cases being the TDC issue. And as a result of that, a clear position was taken. Listen, we are going to take a stand. We are going to suspend our participation until you can, in other words, until there's a ceasefire, until there's a stop to the mass retrenchment, and let us now sit around the table and discuss how do we all share the burden of adjustment to come out of the situation. So I think that those things required clarification. The other thing had to do with a statement by a particular former minister on a particular television program, who had the audacity to insult thousands of workers when he said two things. He said Petrotrin is a ward of the state. First of all, throwing around terms that have absolutely no relevance or is factually inaccurate, it tells me that you're being mischievous deliberately. Because legally, when a ward of the state is a legal term when someone is placed in the under the legal protection of the state by a court. You follow me? Mm. That's what it means to be under the to be a ward of the state. It's a legal terminology. So to first of all say that Petrotrin is a ward of the state is inaccurate. Secondly, it is to also not recognize the fact that that same Petrotrin has contributed some $5 billion per year for a number of years between 2010 leading up until 2014, 2015. So how can you say that the state enterprise that has contributed some $4 to $5 billion per year, consider it even a ward of the state? If also, it doesn't take into consideration, and this is something that people don't think about, that the workers at Petrotrin contribute, and you're going to hear it, over $200 million in taxes every year. That is their contribution to the state. Not the other way around. That is their contribution to the state. All right? And finally, he went on, and this is when he got really disrespectful. And when he said, OWTU is a ward of the state. And we condemn that statement outrightly, because taking a stand for this country, taking a stand for ordinary working people, taking a stand for what is right, taking a stand for social justice, cannot be considered that your institution, an institution which have been doing so for some 80 years, and to insult that 80 years of struggle, that 80 years of legacy, to insult it by saying that the OWT is a ward of the state is gross negligence, irresponsible, and disrespectful on the part of that particular person. So, having gotten that out of the way, I want to talk about this whole question of austerity. You see, it is clear that the government, Minister of Finance and government, have decided that the way for Trinidad and Tobago to respond to the crisis is to engage in austerity. Now, austerity means job losses, cut in social programs. In other words, the people that bear the burden are always only the poor, the vulnerable, ordinary working people. Those are the ones who pay the price. Under austerity, they're the only ones who bear the burden, Avron, Trinidad and Tobago. And there are examples all over the world where governments who engage in a policy of austerity, in the end, only hurt the poor, the vulnerable, and ordinary working citizens. And we're saying that that cannot be right, that cannot be fair, and that certainly cannot be just. But here is the thing. There is an alternative. And this is my message here this afternoon. There is an alternative to austerity. And the question we have to start to ask, the hard questions we have to ask the government, Minister of Finance, why are you taking the country down a road of austerity which will not bring us out of the crisis, but will only increase the hardship, pain, and suffering on ordinary people? Why would you do that? Because it benefits a few? Is that it? Because it benefits a few? In other words, the few that amass the huge wealth in this country, you don't want them to share any part of the pie. If they're taking the whole 85% of the pie I've run, in other words, during this crisis, it means that they have to continue to take their 85% of the pie, which means the other smaller part has to be divided even smaller amongst guess who? The rest of us. The rest of us. And there are very good examples Portugal is a classic example. Portugal in 2011 was in deep crisis. It was one of what is called the pigs. Portugal, Italy, Greece, Spain. And Portugal, up until 2015, engaged in austerity. And it created mass chaos. It created mass chaos in that country. Eventually, when there was an election in 2015, a center-left government came into power. And what that center-left government decided to do was to say, listen, we are not going down that road, you know. They actually won the election on a ticket of anti-austerity. So they won an anti-austerity, they won the elections on that ticket of anti-austerity. And here what is the amazing part, is that they were able, I'm reading here from a Guardian in February 2017, not Trinidad Guardian, huh? that the Portuguese government was able to slash the debt-heavy country's budget deficit to its lowest level in more than 40 years, despite warnings that its anti-austerity policies could spell financial disaster. So they were able to bring down their debt. Why? What did they do? They engaged in public investment to grow their economy. Because once they were able to get the economy heated again, get the economy going again, get small and medium businesses going again, put workers back into work. So, for example, they were able to restore civil servant salaries because the previous government engaged in austerity and slashed public servant salaries, slashed jobs. They did the opposite. They engaged in public investment where they reinstated the salaries of the public servants, and they were able to put people back on work. Why? Because as people were back on work, they get the economy going. Another example of alternative to austerity people don't pay attention to was Obama. Obama in 2008 took a decision to engage in public investment rather than austerity. And you see that the U.S. economy has shown recovery. Let us be clear. How did the U.S. economy show recovery? It was because of public investment. It was because the Obama administration, rather than going down the road of austerity, went down the road of public investment. Okay. Now, interestingly enough, the labor movement did present to the government, Avron, and I want to keep on hammering this point, an alternative. It was called LEAP, Labor's Economic Alternative Plan. And the idea was that the alternative, because it was meant to be an alternative to austerity and any other neoliberal measures that would have reduced workers' terms and conditions, caused significant job losses, and further threaten the social fabric of Trinidad and Tobago. So what I want to do is just to spend a little time with Trinidad and Tobago to explain what that alternative was. And as I explained earlier, using examples of countries that were able to come out of the crisis through public investment rather than austerity, the idea was to halt the long-term slide of growth, because what was identified is that over the last 20 years, this country's economy have been shrinking. So the idea was to halt that slide and kickstart the economy, and then once you've done that, once you've kickstarted the economy, then you can keep the growth steady. And the proposal included, in terms of halting the slide of growth, to support new business activity, boost consumer spending on local production, and boost exports to earn foreign currency. Because, of course, we've seen the foreign currency crisis, right? And to accomplish these three objectives, which is to support new business activity, boost consumer spending on local production, and it's not just to boost consumer spending in general. It is to boost consumer spending on local production, and then to boost exports to earn foreign currency. So that the local, this proposal would have seen our local manufacturing sector generating revenue. We would have brought alive our manufacturing sector. But here is this: not just manufacturing goods which are not unique. The idea would be, how do you find your competitive advantages that to work towards manufacturing unique goods that are particularly indigenous, that we are able to add value to even as we export. So these objectives would have been met by three policy instruments: a fiscal policy instrument, a monetary policy instrument, and a social policy instrument. And the fiscal policy instrument was to see what we'll call a radical stimuli injection as public investment, some 3% of the GDP. Our GDP in 2015 was something like $190 billion. So you're talking about just 3% of that. So it's about $5.7 billion in investment going towards what? Massive expansion in food production, with supporting expansion in processing capacity, infrastructural projects, which is road repair and new roads, because a lot of communities and a lot of areas still have access roads issues, investment in tourism and manufacturing, all right, with support for overseas market development. And then a fourth one, which is a real tangible investment in expanding our range of energy products, because oil and gas are their raw materials. Where you really make the money is downstream, where you are able to come up with products, and there are over 2,000 products you can get from in particular petroleum. At the moment we're talking about, we probably have about 5. We manufacture 5 or 6, whether it's gasoline, kerosene, LPG, etc. And the idea would be, let's put some investment in having a wider variety of energy products that we can export. In other words, going beyond simply fuel. And then in terms of the monetary policy had the idea of creating what was called, or setting up something called, an industrial development fund. This fund will be capitalized from like the credit union movement, who have an asset base of about 10 billion. The NIB's asset base is about 27 billion. And local banks who have excess liquidity, some $3 billion. And the idea would be to mobilize about 5% of these local resources, which will be about 2 billion, which you then provide as low interest loans to small and medium businesses. But here is the catch. It has to be on 2 conditionalities. 1, that they can bring in foreign exchange, and 2, of course, that they ensure that they follow good industrial relations practice. Okay? And then you have the social policy, which looks at all these social programs. How do you streamline the social programs and bring about efficiency? And how do you sustain that growth? That sustaining the growth requires massive changes among stakeholders in terms of the government, in terms of labor, business, and of course, even us, the local consumer, us, ordinary citizens, can be part and can contribute to this alternative plan. So, I share this with Trinidad and Tobago to make a clear statement this afternoon that there is an alternative to austerity. And the hard question we have to ask the government and the Minister of Finance, why are they insisting on taking the country down a road of austerity? Even in countries that were heavily debt burdened and had low revenues, they were able to stimulate their economy. In other words, grow out of the crisis rather than try to cut your way out of the crisis, because the austerity programs that were implemented in many countries failed and created hardship, great hardship and chaos in those countries. And at the end of the day, Avron, Trinidad and Tobago, in a crisis such as this, what you find is that it is only the poor, the vulnerable, ordinary working people who are carrying that burden. And it cannot be that we are back almost in the same place as we were in the 1980s, and we are going to take the same road, which road has led us to the ripping apart of families and communities, and have us in a state of insecurity. So why take us down that road? In the interest of a few?
What's the definition of madness again?
Well, we see it. We may have to call it the austerity madness project, because, or MAP, madness austerity project, Because it cannot be that we are going around in a circle, and at the end, the only people we hurting are the ordinary citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, whilst the few elites continue to make no sacrifice, in fact, continue to benefit even in this crisis, in fact, exploiting the crisis to even enrich themselves even further at the expense of the rest of Trinidad and Tobago. And this is why we must always take a stand for Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you very much for joining me this afternoon. Good to have you back, Avron. And I hope next week we'll have another installment as we lead up to August 4th, where we bring Labor Day into Port of Spain. Thank you and have a good afternoon.